There is a type of person who keeps ending up in the same relationship. Not the same person necessarily. The faces change, the names are different, the circumstances shift just enough to feel new. But somewhere around the third month or the sixth or the second year, something familiar returns. A tension that feels strangely recognizable. A disappointment that, if you are honest, does not entirely surprise you. And yet most people do not notice the pattern, or they notice it but they frame it as bad luck, as a streak of wrong people, as timing, as the world failing to produce someone worth staying for. This framing is understandable. It is also a little too convenient. Because the one constant in every relationship you have ever been in is not the other person. It is you, the way you enter, what you look for, what you decide to overlook, what you call chemistry, what you tell yourself that first feeling means. This episode is not about fixing your romantic choices. It is not a checklist. It is about something older and stranger than that. Something that lives below the surface of attraction itself and rarely gets examined. She had been single for almost 2 years when she met him. Not lonely exactly. She had her work, her friendships, the quiet life she had built with deliberate care. But there was a part of her that remained alert, the way people are alert when they are waiting for something without admitting it. He was different from the others, she thought. Quieter than the men she usually found herself drawn to, more internal. He listened in a way that felt almost unusual, like he was genuinely paying attention and not simply waiting for his turn to speak. On their second conversation, he said something that caught her off guard, something about how he preferred to think before he talked, that words felt important to him, that he did not like saying things he did not mean. She remembered that detail for weeks. She told herself it was because she valued depth. She had always valued depth, and maybe that was true, but there was something else happening, something she could not quite name yet. When she was near him, she felt a version of herself she liked, more articulate, more interesting, more whole somehow, as though his presence called something forward in her that usually stayed dormant. She noticed herself dressing slightly differently before she saw him, not dramatically. A quieter version of herself, somehow more considered. She noticed that she thought more carefully before speaking, that she held back the quick, performative observations she usually reached for in conversation. Around him, she wanted to be slower, more honest, more like the person she privately believed she could be, given the right conditions. By the third month, she had started to feel responsible for his moods. She noticed when he was quiet and assumed it was something she had done. She adjusted her tone, softened her requests, became careful in ways she had not intended to become careful. She was not afraid of him. That is important to note. She was afraid of losing the feeling. The particular feeling of being around someone who made her feel like the better version of herself. When the relationship ended, not dramatically, not with cruelty, just with the slow recognition that they wanted different things, she grieved it longer than the relationship seemed to warrant. She could not explain this to her friends. She had known him for less than a year, but what she was grieving was not just him. It was the self she had felt she could access when she was near him. That self did not disappear. It had simply gone back underground, and she had no idea it had always been hers. Here is what the mind tends to do in these moments. It finds a story that is simple and survivable. He was the right person at the wrong time. She was not ready. The connection was real, but life got in the way. These narratives are not lies exactly, but they are incomplete in a way that protects something. They allow the person to move on without looking too closely at what the attraction was actually about. The uncomfortable question is not why the relationship ended. The uncomfortable question is why that particular person felt so significant in the first place. Think about what happens in the early stages of romantic attraction. There is a quality to it that resembles recognition more than discovery, as though you are not meeting someone new but remembering something. A feeling of finding, of arriving, of finally. The intensity of that feeling is often taken as evidence of its validity. We treat it as a signal. This is the real thing, this person is different, this matters. But what if the feeling is not primarily about them? What if the intensity has less to do with who they actually are and more to do with what they appear to represent? Something inside you that you have not fully claimed. This is an uncomfortable idea. It suggests that the person you fell for might have been, at least in part, a surface onto which something was being projected. And it raises a question that most people do not want to sit with. How much of what you loved was ever really them? The mind resists this framing. It feels diminishing. It seems to reduce the other person to a prop or to reduce your feelings to an illusion. But that is a misreading. The feelings were real. The question is about their source, and understanding their source is not the same as denying them. There is also a second layer of distortion, quieter than the first. It lives in how the story gets told afterward. People replay what happened, the conversations, the silences, the moments when something changed, and they revise as they go. They edit in meaning that may not have been present at the time. They remember the early warmth more vividly than the later confusion. They remember the grief more clearly than the relief. This is not dishonesty. It is the ordinary work of a mind that needs coherence. But it creates a version of the relationship that is cleaner than the real one was. And the cleaner the version, the harder it becomes to examine what was actually happening underneath the surface of attraction itself. The story you have told yourself about your most significant relationships, is it the full story? Or is it the version that was most manageable to carry? Carl Jung had a specific idea about why certain people feel fated. He called it projection, not in the casual sense the word is used today, not simply putting your feelings onto someone else. He meant something more structural, more rooted. He meant that the human psyche carries within it an image, a template, a figure that represents the qualities the conscious self has not fully developed or acknowledged. For most people, this figure lives in the unconscious. It is made up of all the qualities that were suppressed, discouraged, or simply left undeveloped in the process of becoming who you are. The parts of yourself that felt too soft, or too intense, or too much. The capacities for feeling, or for stillness, or for boldness that you learned to keep quiet. Not because those qualities were taken from you violently, but because life requires us to narrow ourselves in order to function, to choose roles, to adopt identities, to become legible to the world around us. In that narrowing, something is always left behind. Jung called this figure the anima in men, the animus in women. Though the specifics matter less than the principle, that each person carries an inner image of what they lack, and that this image gets projected outward when someone appears to embody it. This is why certain people feel immediately significant. They are not just themselves, they are carrying your projection. They have, without knowing it, walked into a role that was already written, a role shaped not by who they are, but by what your unconscious has been quietly waiting to find. The intensity of the attraction, then, is partly a measure of how long the projection has been held, how rarely this figure appears in your life, how much you have missed the qualities being projected. Here is the part that tends to destabilize people when they really sit with it. The person you love in those early weeks may be more a reflection of your own incomplete interior than an accurate perception of another human being. This does not mean the love is fake. It means the love is, at least initially, somewhat blind, not in the romantic sense of overlooking flaws. Blind in a more specific way, blind to the actual person, because the actual person is temporarily obscured by the image being placed over them. And the relationship will eventually require you to meet that person, not the image, not the projection, the actual, complicated, limited, surprising human being in front of you. Many relationships do not survive that transition. Not because the love was not real, but because the love was built on an image. And when the image cracks, when the person does something unexpected or ordinary or disappointing in the specific way that real people inevitably are, the attraction does not know what to do. It has no structure for that reality. It was calibrated for something else, for the figure, for the stand-in, not for the person. Jung was not romantic about this. He thought the disillusionment was necessary, that you could not actually love someone, not in any deep or lasting sense, until the projection was withdrawn enough for genuine encounter to take place. Until you were seeing them, not seeing yourself reflected back in a flattering light. So what is actually being sought in romantic attraction? There is an easy answer: connection, intimacy, love, and those are real. But beneath them, in many cases, there is something more specific, something that Jung would recognize immediately. The person you are drawn to is often carrying the qualities you have not permitted yourself to develop. The man who is attracted to someone fiercely independent may be someone who has not yet given himself permission to trust his own direction. The woman drawn to someone emotionally articulate may be someone whose own emotional life has been carefully managed, kept orderly, kept quiet. The person who falls for someone who seems utterly at ease in the world may be someone who has spent years performing competence while feeling, underneath, profoundly uncertain. What you call chemistry is sometimes the recognition of your own missing interior. And this creates a particular kind of dependence that goes unacknowledged. It does not feel like dependence. It feels like love. It feels like finding. But underneath, it is a dynamic in which the other person is unknowingly being asked to carry something that belongs to you, to embody the qualities you need to encounter in yourself. This is why losing that person can feel so disproportionately devastating. You are not only losing them, you are losing access to a part of yourself you never learned to reach on your own. There is a particular grief that comes from this kind of loss, different from the grief of simply missing someone you loved. It has an edge of helplessness to it, a sense of incompleteness that has nothing to do with them specifically, and everything to do with the discovery that you are further from yourself than you realized. That there is a distance between the person you are in daily life and the person you briefly felt capable of being when they were near you. That distance is the projection working, and it does not close simply by finding another person who can hold the image again. Jung was precise about this. The problem with projection is not that it happens. It is unavoidable, especially early in any significant relationship. The problem is when it never gets withdrawn, when the relationship never moves past the stage where the other person is a mirror and becomes something more difficult and more genuine, a genuine encounter with a separate, autonomous human being. The hidden motivation in many relationships is not intimacy, it is retrieval, a search for something that was lost or never fully formed in the self. And the person who fits the image becomes, for a time, the carrier of that search. They rarely know it, you rarely know it, but the weight of it is present in every expectation, every disappointment, every moment of inexplicable intensity. Here is where the question becomes personal in a different way. If the person you keep choosing reflects something unfinished in you, then the pattern is not a problem of finding the right person. The pattern is a symptom of an inner condition, a gap, a place in the self that has not been met with enough honesty. This is not a comfortable framing. It removes the problem from the external world, from fate, from bad luck, from the shortage of quality people, and places it somewhere you cannot easily avoid, inside. But it also changes the nature of the work. Because if the attraction is partly a projection of the self, then what the relationship is ultimately asking you to do is not find someone to complete you. It is asking you to recognize what you were projecting, to pull the image back, to begin developing in yourself the qualities you kept outsourcing to others. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the slow, uncomfortable process of becoming more fully yourself. Not a fixed self, not a finished self, but a self that has met its own darkness and its own depth with some degree of honesty. The person who does this work does not stop falling in love. They do not become detached or clinical about attraction. But the love they are capable of begins to change. It becomes less about being completed and more about genuine encounter. It becomes possible to be with someone and also to be with yourself. Consider what that actually looks like in practice. It does not look like calm detachment. It does not look like having it all figured out. It looks more like a person who is able to feel attracted and also curious about what that attraction is telling them, curious about the gap it is pointing toward, willing to hold both the feeling and the question at the same time. It looks like someone who does not need the other person to stay exactly as they appeared in the beginning. Someone who can tolerate the ordinary, the disappointing, the mundane, because they are not asking that person to carry something essential, because they have begun to carry it themselves. That is a different kind of relationship than most people have experienced. It requires a different kind of person, not a perfect one, a less projected one. And that shift begins not when you find the right partner. It begins when you start asking what the partners you have already chosen have been quietly telling you about yourself. Most people will not ask this question, not because they are incapable of it, but because the answer requires something uncomfortable. It requires looking at the attraction, the intensity, the grief, the pattern, and considering the possibility that all of it has been, at least in part, a conversation with yourself. That the person who felt fated was partly a messenger. That the relationship that hurt the most was teaching something specific about what remains unmet inside you. There is a version of this realization that feels crushing. If the attraction was partly projection, then what was real? If the intensity was partly about your own interior, then was any of it genuine connection? These are understandable questions. They come from a place that is trying to protect something, the memory, the meaning, the sense that the experience mattered. But those questions rest on a false premise. They assume that projection and genuine feeling are opposites. They are not. A projection is not an invention. It is a displacement, something real, something yours, placed onto a surface that seemed to reflect it back. The longing was real. The need was real. The parts of yourself that you recognized in another person, those were real too. They just were not as fully theirs as you believed. This distinction, once you sit with it long enough, becomes less destabilizing and more clarifying, because it means the qualities you were drawn to are not lost when the relationship ends. They belong to you. They always did. The work that remains is not to find someone who embodies them again, but to begin the slower process of finding them inside yourself. There is no resolution to offer here, not because resolution is impossible, but because the resolution belongs to you. It emerges from the kind of looking that cannot be done in one sitting, one episode, one conversation. It is slower than that, quieter than that. It requires returning to the moments that still carry weight and asking different questions than the ones you usually ask. Not why did they leave, or why did it fail, or what was wrong with them. But what was I looking for? What did I find? What part of me was present in that relationship that I have not yet found a way to carry on my own? Those questions do not resolve quickly. They are not meant to. They are meant to stay open, to create a different kind of attention, one that is less focused on the next person and more honest about what has already passed through your life. Jung suggested that until the projection is withdrawn, you are not truly in a relationship with another person. You are in a relationship with an image, and the person across from you is waiting, without knowing it, to be seen. Romantic attraction is not simple. It was never meant to be. The intensity, the recognition, the grief, none of it is random. It is patterned. And patterns, once you can see them clearly enough to name them, begin to loosen their hold. Not immediately, not painlessly. But the person who starts to see the projection, who begins to recognize what they have been quietly carrying and quietly seeking, stands in a different relationship to themselves. A more honest one, a lonelier one at first, and then, gradually, a more genuinely connected one. Not because they have fixed themselves, but because they have stopped asking another person to do it for them. There is something that gets easier slowly when you begin to do this kind of looking. Not the falling that does not change much, not the wanting or the grief when something ends. Those are human constants. What changes is the quality of attention you bring to them. You become less convinced that a feeling is a verdict, less certain that intensity equals rightness. You start to hold the experience of attraction with a slightly different posture, still present in it, still moved by it, but also watching. Asking, staying curious about what is yours and what belongs to the person in front of you. That is not a romantic way to talk about love, but it may be a truer one. Because real intimacy, the kind that does not erode after the projection fades, requires two people who are willing to be seen as they actually are. Not as the image the other person needed, not as a mirror, as a person, separate, limited, real. That kind of relationship is quieter than the ones that begin with the feeling of having finally found something. It is less urgent, less dazzling, but it is also more durable, more genuinely shared. It is built on something more stable than projection, on the slow, accumulating knowledge of who someone actually is. And that begins, always, with the willingness to know who you actually are first. You do not have to arrive at that place all at once. Most people never fully do, but the direction matters, the willingness to look matters. The small, unglamorous decision to stop waiting for someone to appear and hand you back the parts of yourself you have been keeping in reserve, that is where it starts. Not with the right person, with a more honest account of yourself.